it was the media which was the biggest, it was the free media which was the biggest check and balance on him and the biggest guarantee of liberty in Peru in those days. And that's something to keep in mind also.
How can we secure our individual freedom? To discuss the most important question in the dawn of this digital era, we invite Mr. William Waack, journalist and master in political science, and Mr. James Robinson, one of the most prestigious economists in the field of political economy and economic history, and co-author of Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor. James, William, welcome to the Fórum da Liberdade.
We want to talk about liberty and challenges to liberty. So let me talk about where liberty comes from, at least according to one theory. So in our book, The Narrow Corridor, which Gabriel mentioned, we present a framework for thinking about the emergence of liberty that I find useful for thinking about discussing these challenges to liberty in the world along the lines that Gabriel mentioned. So, and there's two elements to it in some sense. There's the power of the state, you could say, the power of the state to control or dominate society, and the power of society to counterbalance that. Okay, Shang Yang, Lord Shang, one of the kind of intellectual mentors of the first Qin dynasty. And he says, in one of his surviving writings, when the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state strives to weaken the people. So this dominance of state over society in China is very ancient, and it's built into the whole philosophy of the first dynasty and indeed the imperial state. And I put Confucius and Lord Shang up here because sometimes people sort of contrast the Confucian way of thinking with the legalist way of thinking, but their view here was fairly similar, in fact, and that's a philosophy, roll on a couple of thousand years. Lord Shang was writing about 100 years before the first dynasty, but here we are today, Tiananmen Square, 1989. If you've been in Beijing recently, you'll see these millions of these face recognition cameras coming up everywhere as part of this new system of individual credit, the social credit system, they say, to kind of monitor every individual. And there's Chairman Mao in the background. So this is in Tiananmen Square today with all these cameras. Okay, so there's an example of, I think everyone understood, this is something John Locke understood in the 17th century, that a situation where you have a very powerful state and a kind of very weak society doesn't lead to a situation of liberty. So and a lot of the book is about the history, historic world, history of different parts of the world, trying to understand how come Europe and North America ended up with something much more like a balance between the state and the society, whereas China ended up in a situation where the state dominated society, or Yemen ended up in the opposite. Many other parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or South Asia, where the society dominated the state. And that's, I can't really talk about that too much. It's a process of historical contingency and kind of the emergence of particular circumstances where the state and society kind of balanced each other. Lord Shang was not true that when the people are weak, the state is strong. It might be true in China that the state is strong and the people are weak, but actually it's the parts of the world with the strongest society that have the strongest state in our theory. So there isn't the trade-off that Lord Shang emerged. And to think about, I think this diagram, at least in my mind, is useful for thinking about the challenges to liberty that come from technological change or information technology or innovation or wherever they are, because the challenges come from both sides. The challenges come from the state wanting to kind of amass power and control at the expense of society, and that sort of throws you out of the corridor on one side. But it can also be society populism, if you like, or eroding the institutions of the state, or eroding the shackled Leviathan. And then you have the concern of exiting on the other side, if you like. So you can go out of the corridor in either ways. And at least in my own mind, I find this useful for just thinking about, where does liberty come from? Well, it comes from being in this corridor. And how do we think about the implications of different sorts of challenges? Well, they present challenges to staying in the corridor. So let me. There's too much to talk about. Let me end there, and let's see where we go.
Is liberty a prerequisite? It's a precondition for success, for growth, for development, for power in terms of competition among nations? That's the first, I think, essential, fundamental question that you address. How do we preserve those rights and liberties that, as you very intelligently state, liberty is not something absolute. It has a historical background. Until societies achieve a level of liberties and a level of balance that you describe as a very narrow corridor, a tense one. It's a very narrow passage in which you have, like that big ship in the Suez Canal recently, there is a very, very narrow margin in which a strong wind can you make across that narrow corridor and block everything. And that's a very particular, impressive image, how external factors can make your ship in history drive across that narrow corridor. So let's address the first subject, James, and ask you, considering the present success of China, which is a despotic country, no doubts about. You have mentioned it in your presentation, in your opening remarks. How do you describe liberty as a precondition for success?
Yeah, I think in terms of what we know, economists have known at least since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s that what drives prosperity is innovation. It's creativity, it's entrepreneurship, it's new ideas, new products, new ways of doing things, new ways of building things. And that's what the Industrial Revolution was about, the steam engine and the factory system and mechanization of spinning and weaving. And that's what generates. And who is it that does that? How does a society do that? It's the creativity and innovativeness of the people. And so to have a prosperous society, you need to be able to harness all that latent talent that you have. Okay? And the idea that this is somehow your ability to do that is connected to liberty comes from the fact that, people have to have the freedom to just follow their ideas and their dreams and their passions and their projects. And they have to be protected, and they have to believe that if they do that, they'll be able to enjoy the fruits of that innovativeness and creativity. And I think what the history of the world suggests is that that's impossible to do without basic political guarantees. You don't get rule of law or property security or property rights through the whim of some dictator. That comes from hard-won building of institutions and creating a context of liberty. I think the Chinese case, sure, if I go back to the 1978, China was a very poor country. It was incredibly technologically backward. It had very, what I would call extractive institutions. And what happened? What did Deng Xiaoping do? Deng Xiaoping started dismantling that. He started giving much more economic freedom to people. People decide what to do, deregulating prices, allowing people to choose what to produce. He just dismantled the control of the party over the economy. And the consequence was this enormous boom. What do we say about that? I'd say there's lots of booms like that in world history. There's lots of transitory booms like that. But that's not sustainable. You can't, of course, China can do incredibly well by just borrowing other people's technology, stealing ideas that other people created. You don't have to create them yourself. You just take them. You don't respect intellectual property rights. You take advantage of this whole globalized world and your low wages. And yeah, they've done incredibly well. But how do you keep that thing? How do you sustain that? China failed. Deng Xiaoping had this idea of making a transition to a different type of political system. And that didn't work. President Xi has basically destroyed that. And I think what you know from Chinese history and world history is that this kind of autocratic rule, maybe it's turning into a very personalized type of rule, which is kind of typical in Chinese history, is never going to be consistent with maintaining economic freedom or liberty. And so it's never going to be consistent with having a genuinely innovative or prosperous economy. Look what's happening to Jack Ma at the moment. If you criticize the Communist Party, you're finished. They're fining him. They're going to break his business up. And so that's what happens. And you see that coming. And that is not consistent with a successful capitalist economy. That's my view.
James, how can we improve participation without falling in some kind of majorities dictatorship, James? That's my final question.
Yeah, I think that again, that is about institutional design. I think ever since if you read Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle contrasts these different types of political systems. And it's a very modern discussion. He doesn't like kind of one person rule or whatever. He wouldn't have approved of presidency because that's bound to turn into tyranny. That's what Aristotle says. But also he was very worried about democracy because he thought, you'd have a majority of people would just basically exploit the minority. So you have to spread power. And again, John Locke said, okay, you need to have representation and accountability, but you need to separate powers. You need to spread power across different institutions. So I think, this is one of the deepest ideas in political theory, that the way to cope with these populist pressures is to spread power, to protect people, to develop system of rights, that's been something we've understood a long time. Of course, it's difficult. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Waack, that people vote to dismantle checks and balances. That's very common in every kind of populist experience in Latin America. The Chavismo, if you look at the early days of Chavismo, what Chavez wanted was to get rid of all of these checks and balances, basically. And so, that's a challenging moment for democracy also. This and I don't know what I can say. I would say one thing, since you're a journalist, I think what we also know is how incredibly important the media is. If you think about President Fujimori, for example, and the collapse of liberty under President Fujimori, it's really interesting if you look at who he bribed. So his security, Vladimiro Montesinos, who was one of his people, who was in charge of corrupting the system, bribed Congress people, he bribed Supreme Court judges. But the thing which was really important was to control the media, was to control television, was to control newspapers. In fact, I think it cost, if I remember correctly, it cost $25,000 a month to get a Supreme Court justice to basically do what you want. It cost $1 million to control a TV station. So one of the most interesting things about that experience is that it was actually, for the way Fujimori saw it, it was the media which was the biggest, it was the free media which was the biggest check and balance on him and the biggest guarantee of liberty in Peru in those days. And that's something to keep in mind also.
William, James, thank you very much for the panel. I think it was not just a panel, it was a lecture from both of you. We've learned a lot from this 1 hour and something, and we're very happy to have you here, and we hope next year we'll have you here in person, probably everybody vaccinated, so we'll be together and we can have a better discussion in this hybrid form, online and in person together. Thank you very much.